Teachers, which student turned out to be a psychopath? When I was in second grade, I had this teacher who was about 4 months pregnant. As a kid, I was really active and loved running around the classroom during breaks. One day, the bell rang and we were supposed to sit down. But my 2 friends and I kept running and playing. Suddenly, my teacher appeared right in front of me, and I accidentally bumped into her stomach, hard. She winced in pain and said it really hurt. She told me she needed to talk to my parents. 2 days later, my teacher called in sick, and we got a substitute teacher. About a week after that, my mom told me that my teacher had a miscarriage. I never saw her again. I still don't know if I was the reason it happened, but as a kid, I believed it was my fault. That thought has stayed with me ever since. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe for more. I'm not entirely sure if this would be considered sociopathic or psychopathic, but I once had a child who became disturbingly obsessed with my pregnancy during the first 7 months. He wanted to name the baby, talked to my belly constantly, and seemed fascinated by the whole thing. Then one day, it seemed to click for him that once the baby was born, I'd be leaving for maternity leave. He came very close to me, leaned in, and whispered, "When you come out, I'm going to kill you with a hammer. I hate you." I was shocked. I immediately took him to the office, and the school psychologist, LSSP, asked him why he said that. He replied, "Because it will take her away. I wanted to die so she stays here." He was on several medications for his severe violent tendencies. He had once tried to kill his sister by pushing her in front of a bus. His mother even kept him locked in his room at night because she had found him standing over her with a knife. Edit: the child was a 10-year-old boy. His mother eventually agreed to have him committed after he tried to kill a police support dog with a pair of scissors. Both MHMR, Mental Health and Mental Retardation Services, and CPS, Child Protective Services, were involved. I haven't seen or heard from the family since I left the district. I once worked with a student who completely fit that description. The list of things he did could fill pages. One example that really stuck with me happened one day when he got up from his seat to throw something away. On his way back, he walked behind another student who was quietly focused on his assignment. Out of nowhere, he shoved the student's head forward into the desk, hard enough to give him a bloody nose. There had been no argument, no tension, nothing to provoke it. His parents were divorced, and his mother was so afraid of him that she refused to have him during her custody days. His father, on the other hand, would move him from school to school every time his behavior got bad enough for the school to start the process of getting him placed in psychiatric care. There was a little girl in my kindergarten class who had a pair of scissors. I turned around just in time to see her reach over and try to cut off another girl's ponytail. It wasn't a big deal in the end, she hadn't actually managed to cut anything, but I was still taken aback because the two of them usually got along very well. I asked her why she was going to do that. In a calm, simple, and completely matter-of-fact tone, she replied, "Because her hair is what she loves the most." That answer sent chills down my spine. When I was doing my student teaching with an 8th grade class, there was one student who constantly got into trouble. During the rare moments when he was actually in class, he would just sit there staring off with this completely vacant look in his eyes. It honestly terrified me. There was something deeply unsettling about him. One day, he was up at the whiteboard along with a few other students, correcting sentences. I wasn't really paying much attention to the group when suddenly I heard this blood-curdling scream. I looked up and saw that he had brought a hypodermic needle and had stabbed the girl next to him in the leg. Apparently, he had been holding it in his hand the whole time, just waiting for a chance to use it on someone. It was horrifying, but thankfully, the girl turned out okay. The worst part, though, was the way he laughed when security came to take him away. I still shudder just thinking about it. I once had a high school freshman who was loud, energetic, and a bit immature for his age. One day, he was being disruptive and acting up in class, so I asked him to step outside with me while my co-teacher continued the lesson. I calmly explained why I had taken him out, how his behavior was disruptive, and asked him to be more mindful moving forward. He seemed attentive and understanding. But just as we were about to go back in, he looked at me and said, "Okay, I'm gonna start crying so everyone thinks you yelled at me." I stopped immediately. I asked him why he would want to do that, why he thought it was okay to lie like that and make me look like a bad person when I had been calm and respectful the entire time. He didn't have any real answers, but we had already been out of class long enough. I got him to agree to go back in quietly, and we continued with the lesson. Needless to say, it was a sign of things to come. He turned out to be a gossiping, manipulative little social monster. The more mature students learned to keep their distance from him, while he surrounded himself with kids who enjoyed his antics and copied his behavior. We finished the year on decent terms, but as he moved on to other teachers with different classroom styles, his behavior only got worse and ended up derailing several classes. I once taught a 15-year-old boy who gave off a very unsettling vibe. For a creative writing assignment, he turned in a story that was deeply disturbing. It described, in unsettling detail, how a blonde, fair-skinned woman was harmed as part of an attempt to ruin the purity she pretended to have. Reading it was genuinely uncomfortable, especially since I shared those same physical traits. When the assistant principal confronted him, he went on a rant about how he hated every girl in the class because they were all stupid, even though none of them had ever interacted with him, positively or negatively. Later, he gave me a handwritten apology, but several of the lines had been aggressively scratched out, and he had drawn little smiley faces beside them. During his final meeting with the assistant principal, he became agitated, stormed out, and started hitting the school fence repeatedly. Sadly, he was never expelled. For what it's worth, I actually am a teacher, but in this case, I was just babysitting. A few weekends ago, I was asked to babysit a 9-year-old girl and her 3-year-old brother. I'd never met the kids before, but I figured it would be easy enough. The 9-year-old and I would just hang out with a mutual understanding that she didn't really need me there, and the 3-year-old would just need some redirection and entertainment. Boy, was I completely wrong. The 9-year-old turned out to be an outright manipulative bully. She gave her little brother jobs to do while playing with Play-Doh, then tore him apart verbally, telling him how terrible he was at every task she assigned. She chased him around the house with a sharpened pencil. She played roughly with him until he got hurt and ran upstairs crying, and then she followed him, laughing, saying, "I'm really sorry." She snatched the TV remote right out of my hand and hid it when I tried to put on a movie. She tried to convince me that his bedtime wasn't what their mom had told me, and got him back up to play with his toy trucks. Then, when I was finally reading him a bedtime story and he was starting to settle down, she came into the room and said, "It's way past his bedtime, he's not allowed any more books." I've never met a child so desperate for control. What really confuses me, though, is where it came from, because, 1, I gave her nothing to push back against. If she'd been acting out because I was treating her like a little kid, I would have understood. But I wasn't. And 2, it was obvious that her parents weren't overly strict with her in general. Honestly, my first clue should have been when her parents offered to pay me more per hour than I'd even asked for. Even with the chance to make $100 in one night, I'm never going back. There was a first grader, I'll call her Madison, not her real name, who once pushed a friend off a high stool in the art room because the other girl wouldn't share her crayon. And by share, Madison meant immediately give it up, even though the other girl was still using it. The friend wasn't seriously hurt, but she said she didn't want to sit next to Madison anymore. I said okay and moved her seat. Madison immediately burst into tears and started insisting that I had to make the other girl sit with her. She said it wasn't fair that I told the other girl she didn't have to share, that it wasn't fair I told her she didn't have to be friends with Madison if Madison was hurting her or making her feel bad, and that it wasn't fair the other girl fell off the stool just to make her look bad. I just can't even with Madison. Nothing is ever her fault. If she steals something, it's always the other student's fault for supposedly giving it to her and then lying about it later. I've actually seen kids doubt themselves, wonder if maybe they had given Madison their stuff, even though I'd literally watched her take it. This girl is 6 years old and already has gaslighting down to a science. I have an ex who's a preschool teacher, and he affectionately calls his students my little sociopaths, not to their faces or parents, of course, because, well, empathy is a learned skill. Let's just put it that way. I honestly had never thought about it until he explained that things like hitting is bad because it hurts people, and hurting people isn't okay, are concepts kids have to learn. He told me that while children feel a wide range of emotions, which we adults often overlook because they can't express them with words, behaviors like caring for others, showing empathy, and understanding emotional consequences are actually skills. They need to be demonstrated, taught, and practiced. And according to him, it's much harder to get kids to grasp those concepts once they're older than 4 or 5. He said around age 3 is when they really start to understand, but many parents still treat 3-year-olds like babies. My mom was also a teacher for decades, and she had her share of truly difficult students. There was one kid, a few years younger than me, who lived in our neighborhood. My mom never said anything outright negative about him. He was the son of one of her friends, but that kid was like something out of a horror movie. He was adopted, and one of the first things he did after his parents brought him home was lock the family dog inside the refrigerator. Another time, he snuck up to our house in the middle of the night, which was terrifying because we lived in the middle of nowhere, and tried to break in. My parents used to leave the doors unlocked at night, so after they went to bed, I would go around locking everything. When he couldn't get in, he cut the electrical wiring to our outdoor lights, plunging everything into complete darkness. Then he slashed the tires on my car and tried to break the windows. He used to attack other kids too, especially younger ones, just because he felt like it. He's around 30 now, and from what I've heard, he hasn't changed much. He still lives with his mom and has gotten her house swatted multiple times because he deliberately goes online, provokes people, and then disappears while she's left to deal with the fallout. I've always wanted to be an adoptive parent myself, but sometimes I have nightmares about that kid. From everything I know, his parents really did try their best, but nothing ever seemed to help. I once had a student who was basically like a little Charles Manson. For context, Charles Manson was a notorious American cult leader in the late 1960s who manipulated his followers into committing a series of brutal murders. He's often used as a symbol of extreme manipulation and lack of empathy. This student had already shown aggressive behavior before, stabbing kindergartners with scissors, hitting, biting, and scratching. By first grade, new behaviors started to appear. He would convince other children to eat crayons or manipulate them into saying hurtful things to their classmates. That same year, he began to show more controlling behavior toward the girls. He would invite them to play, and if they didn't do exactly what he wanted, he'd turn the entire group against them. The result was that the girls ended up trying to earn his approval. When they eventually realized it wasn't worth it and started to ignore him, he became physically aggressive again. This year, second grade, he started seeking out other children with similar mindsets to form a sort of bully group. Of course, the staff is doing everything possible to curb these behaviors, but the parents are extremely combative and quick to threaten legal action. Several school psychologists and social workers have recommended individual therapy and additional social support, but the parents insist none of it is necessary. They've accused us of lying about his behavior and demanded that an outside specialist come to observe him. Naturally, the student behaved perfectly during those observations. He's not unintelligent, he knows exactly what's going on. The parents then used those findings to block any intervention for another 6 months. I don't believe there's such a thing as a child who's beyond help. But there are children who can't be properly supported in a public school setting. This boy needs far more psychological and social assistance, smaller class sizes, and a much higher level of adult supervision. Unfortunately, we simply don't have the resources for that, especially when the parents fight us at every turn. I met this boy when he was only about 2.5 years old, and even then, he was showing very difficult behaviors. He was extremely manipulative. He would chase other children just to hit or kick them. He made up convincing lies to get others in trouble or to blame them for things he had done himself. He was so good at it that sometimes it was hard to prove what was really happening, even though it usually became clear that he was responsible. During nap time, he would get up from his cot and bother the other kids who were trying to sleep. If someone sat next to him, he would try to kick them, and if you tried to stop him by holding him gently, he would scream that you were hurting him, which of course caused even more problems. By the time he was 3, the same behaviors continued, but he started adding disturbing threats. He once said he was going to get a gun or a hammer to hurt a teacher. At 4 years old, the behaviors were escalating. He was strong enough to throw chairs across the classroom, and he scratched and bit other children. We couldn't allow him to have anything sharp. He needed constant supervision, even though there were nearly 20 other kids and only 2 teachers. What made it even more confusing was that between those episodes, he could be incredibly sweet and affectionate. As teachers, we always want to believe that this might be the moment when a child finally starts to trust you. All of us fell for that hope at least once. But the pattern was always the same. He would use those moments to manipulate, and when boundaries were set, he would either play the victim or lash out. By the age of 5, he still wasn't toilet trained, something his grandmother insisted we shouldn't push. One day, he came to class with stitches on his face. His grandmother said the family dog had bitten him. In class, we always had to keep art supplies available, including scissors, and we had to watch him constantly because he tried to use them to hurt other kids. He also started to show some inappropriate sexualized behaviors, which was extremely concerning, but every time we tried to address it, his grandmother became defensive and angry. Child Protective Services were called several times, but we never saw any real follow-up. I eventually didn't want to work in his classroom anymore because I often ended up with bruises or scratches, and the only guidance we were given was to redirect his behavior, which usually meant rewarding him and reinforcing the problem. Finally, when he was about 5.5, a new principal acknowledged that he was a danger to the other children and recommended that he receive outside help. The grandmother immediately withdrew him from school, blaming us for rejecting him. I truly hope that boy eventually got the help he needed. From a very young age, he showed deeply concerning behaviors that only grew worse over time. I hope he was removed from that environment and finally received the right kind of support. I once taught a 4-year-old boy who honestly scared me, not because of anything he did to me personally, but because I fear what he might become in the future. I could easily imagine him growing up to seriously hurt someone someday. He would try to kiss and hug the girls, and when they refused, he'd grab them and do it anyway, even if they cried out or told him to stop. I explained to him that kissing isn't allowed at school, and that if someone doesn't want a hug, they don't have to give or receive one. I also told him that some people simply don't like to be hugged at all. His response was always the same, but I want them to do it. So they will. He simply couldn't understand the idea of boundaries, of any kind. That's just one small example of the things he would do. I referred him for evaluation because I suspected he might be on the autism spectrum, and he's currently in the process of being assessed. But even so, I can't shake the feeling that there's something more to his behavior, something deeper and more troubling. He also watched other children closely to figure out how he was supposed to act. For instance, if one child was sad and another comforted them, he would imitate that behavior in an exaggerated way, using it as an excuse to touch others, especially the girls. He never showed any emotions other than anger or jealousy. There was something deeply unsettling about the look in his eyes. I've never met another child quite like him. Last year, I had a student, let's call him James. When you spoke to him, he would just stare back with a completely blank expression, showing no emotion at all. For context, I teach Japanese in a rural area of Australia. We were studying hobbies, shumi in Japanese. Every other student in my remedial Year 7 class could form a sentence using their chosen hobby, dancing, tennis, soccer, whatever. I had given them a worksheet with a list of possible hobbies to choose from. When it was James's turn, he just shrugged and said, "I don't know." That's not unusual when teaching a language. Plenty of kids dislike the subject or feel embarrassed speaking in front of their peers. I figured I'd talk to him one-on-one while the others worked on their reading and writing activities. When I approached his desk, I found him slowly pressing the edge of a plastic ruler against his notebook, like he was trying to slice it apart. I asked, "What's wrong? What's giving you trouble?" And that was the moment I got the chilling sense that this boy would either end up in prison one day, or do something much worse. With that same empty stare, he said, "I don't have any hobbies. None of these." I tried to prompt him, "That's fine, what kind of things do you like? Maybe I can show you how to say it." He looked up and said flatly, "Guns." Then, after a pause, he added, "and hating cats." I told him that, not liking something wasn't really a hobby, and that weapons weren't appropriate for the assignment. He then said, with complete calm, "What about Ivan Milat? I'm kind of like him, but with cats." For context, Ivan Milat was an Australian serial killer known as the Backpacker Murderer. Between 1989 and 1993, he kidnapped and brutally murdered at least 7 young people in New South Wales. He was arrested in 1994, sentenced to life in prison, and died there in 2019. In Australia, his name is synonymous with cruelty and horrific violence. So hearing a 7th grader compare himself to Milat, saying he was like him, but with cats, left me absolutely frozen. The other students didn't even know who Milat was, but I did. I reported it to the principal and called home. The family confirmed what I said, but told me it was none of my business, and then warned me that my cats would be next if I didn't stop sticking my nose where it didn't belong. In a small town, everyone knows where the teachers live, including my wife and me. The police didn't do anything. And ever since then, every day I walk into that classroom, that boy greets me with the same smile and the same words. "How are your cats today, sir?" I worked for 8 years in the Exceptional Children department. During that time, I was the only man on staff, and some of the students required constant supervision. One of them, I'll call him John, was a very special case. He was in 5th grade at the time. He lived with his parents. His father worked from home as a mechanic. They seemed like ordinary people, but they had no idea how to handle John's behavior. He displayed an unusually advanced and inappropriate awareness of sexuality for his age, which is almost always a red flag that a child has been exposed to things they shouldn't have. John couldn't function well in the classroom, so my job was to sit with him and help him do the best he could. Over time, we developed a certain closeness. He seemed to like having an adult nearby. But he was far behind academically because he missed so much school. Sometimes his parents just didn't send him, and other times he was suspended. Getting him to focus was always a challenge. I worked beside him on his assignments and set up a system. Every time he behaved well and completed his work, he earned 10 extra minutes of outdoor time, something he loved. That was the only non-food reward that worked for him. When he was in a good mood, he could actually work pretty well. But if he was given too many worksheets or got frustrated, things could escalate quickly. I often thought it was better to just let him draw for a while if it meant keeping the peace. One Friday afternoon, while I was working with a small group, John got up to sharpen his pencil. He came back, wrote something down, and then, out of nowhere, grabbed the girl next to him by the hair and raised his pencil like a knife, aiming directly for her eye. I managed to grab his hand just in time and force him to drop it. Using the restraint techniques we've been trained in, I got him down to the floor and held him there while the other students backed away in terror. One of them even picked up the pencil and snapped it against the wall. That image has stayed with me ever since. What truly disturbed me was what John said afterward, in a completely calm voice. I was bored and wanted to see what would happen if I stabbed her in the eye. I was just curious. He genuinely didn't understand why that was wrong. The police came, and both sets of parents, the girls and John's, were notified. During the meeting, John repeated the same words in front of everyone. I still remember the look of horror on his mother's face. His father's reaction was different, not shock, but something else. It was as if he already knew, or recognized the behavior. John was suspended, and the girl's parents pressed charges. The judge, however, dismissed it as a case of a troubled child. John was given probation and community service. After that, he was homeschooled, which in reality meant he was left mostly on his own. Years later, I saw his photo in the newspaper. He was 21 and had been charged with several crimes, aggravated assault, child abuse, and more. In the picture, he had the same cold, expressionless look he'd had the day he attacked that girl. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Over time, I learned more. His mother had taken her own life and left a note. His father had fallen into addiction. Their house later burned down, and John ended up living with an uncle. By his teenage years, he already had a record: fighting, hurting animals, violence toward neighbors. The crime that finally sent him to prison happened when he slammed a young woman's head against a car dashboard until she lost consciousness, because she refused to sleep with him. Thankfully, a police officer happened to be nearby and intervened in time. I'm no longer a teacher, though I still visit schools for my current job. Over my career, I was attacked more times than I can count, and I stopped countless acts of violence. Most of those children came from homes filled with chaos and trauma, the kind of toxic stress that warps the brain over time. It's hard to admit, but it happens. For years, I struggled with post-traumatic stress from these experiences. I deeply admire the teachers who stay, who keep trying to make a difference, and I also understand those who, like me, had to walk away because they simply couldn't take it anymore. So I have this student who moved here from another country about 2 years ago, and I got him in my class this year. I was warned that he could be difficult. At first, we actually got along pretty well. He was loud, stubborn, and challenging at times, but manageable. Then, out of nowhere one day, he asked if we could talk privately. The moment we were alone, he started crying. He told me about his life, how his stepfather was abusive and neglectful, how social services had already been involved before, and how the family had moved because of it. He begged me not to tell anyone or take action because he was afraid things would get worse at home. Of course, I reached out to the school psychologist and my supervisor, and we started discussing how to handle it. We decided to talk to the parents first to get a clearer picture of the situation. When they came in for the meeting, I was completely unprepared for what happened. The mother looked utterly exhausted, like she was at the end of her rope. And then the stepfather, the one the boy had said was abusive, started crying, saying that their son was making their lives a living nightmare. I was absolutely not expecting that. I was providing in-class support for a 6-year-old student who had very concerning behavior. Let's call her Jamie. I was lucky in that Jamie actually liked me, but that didn't stop her from kicking, scratching, or biting me whenever I tried to stop her from hurting others or destroying things. Her teacher and I were working together to collect data for the school diagnostician, but one thing we could never figure out was what triggered her outbursts. When she wanted to be, Jamie could be the sweetest kid. I knew she was capable of doing well academically if she could just stay calm and focus on her work. But at random points throughout the day, she would completely lose control, going on literal rampages in the classroom, throwing things, flipping tables, attacking classmates, screaming, and cursing. Once, she even ran out of the classroom, out a side door of the school, and toward the main road. She would play happily with her friends at recess, and then an hour later I'd be pulling her off those same kids while she kicked and punched at them. I remember one day I took her outside of the classroom to give her space to calm down. I told her, "Jamie, I just want to help you. I want you to feel better so you can go play with your friends. I'm not mad at you, I just want to help. What would make you feel better?" She just stared back at me with a completely blank expression. I have a student in my special ed academic support class who is unbelievably manipulative. My colleague and I, half-jokingly, used to say he'd probably drown a cat just to watch it die, the whole serial killer vibe. He's habitually truant, so most of the time he's not physically present, but when he is, he really knows how to pull everyone's strings. He's not clever enough yet to manipulate adults consistently, but he's very good at stirring up the other students. He picks on kids who are much less capable than he is, instigates situations, and then plays the victim. He gets away with it because the other students aren't able to clearly tell their side of the story. He lies constantly about trivial things. For example, he bragged that a knockoff Louis Vuitton bag he'd gotten at a charity shop was worth $3,000 and threw a fit when I wouldn't let him take it to the bathroom, accusing me of trying to steal it. The next day he admitted he knew it was fake. The one day he actually showed up this month, he accused one of my students of buying drugs. It turned out that a cognitively disabled boy, the one this little sociopath manipulates, had, in the morning, stolen marijuana from his mother and put it in a girl's bag as a prank or whatever. She found it and didn't know what to do, so she left it alone. Then this kid came up to me and reported some grand drug deal. As a result, that girl's things were searched, she was suspended, and her parents grounded her for 6 months. She comes into school miserable every day. He hasn't been back to see the damage he caused, but I'm sure he'll be delighted when he does. I am genuinely relieved on the days his name is on the absence list. He shows up out of nowhere, drops a bomb into the classroom, and disappears for weeks. It's almost insidious. Back when I was in high school, early 90s, I'm old, I had a few guys who were borderline stalkers. One of them used to sit in the trees outside my yard just to wait for me, so he could walk me to school. Another wanted my attention so badly that he kicked out all the windows of my car, and then showed up at my house later with flowers. Ugh. There was also a guy who called my house so much that he broke my answering machine. 3 times. Back then, I didn't really understand how that kind of behavior could escalate, so I didn't make a big deal out of it. I was pretty naive, and being slightly on the spectrum, I wasn't great at reading people. I honestly thought all girls had guys like that in their lives. Eventually, I told my mom about it. She immediately went to the school and spoke with the principal. I have no idea what happened after that. It's been 25 years now. Afterward, I opened up to my friends about it. Most of them were guys, and they had no clue any of this was going on. After that, I never went anywhere alone. It's crazy to think about what we used to consider normal. This was before the internet and social media, and things were just different back then. We were really clueless. Back in middle school, we had this thing where we'd buddy up with a kid from the elementary school. Our school was pretty big. It went from preschool all the way to grade 12. I was paired with a 3rd grader, and from the very beginning, I could tell he was the troublemaker type. As time went on, I noticed something really off about him. He was unusually obsessed with violence, not just for his age, but for anyone's age. I had to step in a few times to stop him from hurting his classmates, and once, he even went after a kid in my grade. It was strange and honestly disturbing. I felt bad for him, though. I couldn't help but think that whatever was wrong probably started at home. But there's one thing that really creeped me out, and it's stuck with me ever since. One day, we were doing an activity for the Big Buddies, the older students who were paired with multiple younger kids, so they could get to know their buddies better. Me and this other student in my grade were drawing pictures of him, while he was supposed to draw pictures of us. I already knew he was a surprisingly good artist, honestly better than some of the kids in my own grade, but I had no idea what kind of stuff he practiced drawing outside of school. I found out that day. When we finished, the two of us proudly showed him our drawings. He immediately grabbed them, tore them to pieces, and threw them away. I was a little annoyed, but whatever, I thought my drawings sucked anyway. Then it was his turn to show us what he'd drawn. And that's when it got scary. He had drawn us, both of us, dead. Our bodies were covered in wounds, dripping blood, detailed and disturbingly realistic for a 9-year-old sketch. The quality made it even more unsettling. He laughed, handed us the drawings, and said, while pointing at mine, "You're the ugly one. You look like this." Yeah. I really didn't enjoy the rest of that school year, seeing that kid every few days. Even now, it still gives me chills. I honestly don't even want to imagine what he's like today. A new student started coming to our school every day. He was friendly and polite with me, and honestly seemed pretty smart compared to many of the other kids. For context, our school was a day treatment facility. Most of our students had serious behavioral or emotional issues. He just seemed a little out of place, like he'd been sent to the wrong program, and I figured he'd transition back to public school fairly quickly. Then the truth came out. He'd been staying at a friend's house for a while. That friend's mother had been murdered, chopped up and stuffed into the trunk of the car parked in the driveway, by her own daughter and the daughter's boyfriend. Apparently, they would just hang out and party there every night while the body sat in the car outside, decaying. The boy would then come to school each morning acting completely normal, as if nothing at all was wrong. They had tried several times to get rid of the body, but for whatever reason, couldn't. If I remember right, this all happened about 15 years ago, and as far as I know, they're all out of jail now. I've worked with a lot of students who have RAD, reactive attachment disorder, and other conditions that keep them in a constant state of survival mode, lying, stealing, manipulating to get what they want. But there's one student who goes above and beyond. I'll call him Joseph. Joseph is in middle school now, after being expelled from elementary school for bringing a weapon. Expulsions aren't permanent, usually just a calendar year. It wasn't a firearm, but it was still considered a weapon. He gets physically violent with his parents whenever they try to enforce boundaries. He says horribly racist and sexually misogynistic things, mostly as a way to either A, get sent home, or B, shock and upset people. Deep down, he truly believes he deserves some kind of prize or reward for doing even the most basic tasks. So, fine, bribe the kid to behave. But he won't even do the bare minimum to earn anything. He lies as easily as he breathes. He's already on track for another expulsion, but students have due process, and there are steps that have to be followed. What really makes him unnerving, though, is how calculated he is. He's not disruptive in class. He saves all of his chaos for the hallways and the bus, the places where he's less likely to be caught. In class, he's quiet, polite, even charming. To me, he's always pleasant and says the right things. "Oh, I'm so sorry, I was just thinking about what to write." Total lie. I'm genuinely worried about anyone who ends up in a relationship with him someday. I had a student join one of my middle school classes about a week into the year as part of a reintegration program for kids with externalizing behavior. Early on, an assistant in the program warned me not to hug him or let him hug me, because there was no way to tell how he might spin it in the future. I'm not much of a hugger anyway, but that comment put me on alert about what kind of kid I was dealing with. Up to that point he'd seemed attentive, engaged, and eager to learn. About a week after he joined, he started dating a girl in the same class. That's when red flags began to appear. The girl had a long history of struggling in relationships, and he began to exploit that. He dictated who she could be friends with and who she should sit or work with, always insisting it be him. He'd physically place himself between her and other students whenever he could, and bragged that the only reason she came to school was because he told her to. Roughly 6 weeks into the year, I glanced out my door and saw his girlfriend leaving another classroom, tears streaming down her face, hugging herself and running toward the girls' restroom. He followed her, calling after her and demanding she talk to him. When I approached, he physically stepped between us, put his hand on the wall to block her path, and told me to fuck off. I ignored him and told the girl to go to the restroom. In his frustration he stepped aside and she slipped by. He was visibly shaking and turning red. He swore at me again and claimed I wasn't even his teacher, he wasn't in my class at the time. He then walked into the girls' restroom and began pounding on the door, shouting for her to come out. An assistant from his program ran down the hall, took over the situation, and told me I could return to my class. To my surprise, that student returned to my room the next period. He smiled and apologized, saying he didn't know why he'd acted that way and promising not to let his temper get the better of him. The whole speech felt rehearsed. Against my better judgment, I let him stay, told him we'd speak after class, and acknowledged his apology. About 10 minutes into that lesson, he started to look agitated. Then he got up and, pushing other students out of the way, walked straight across the room toward a girl who wasn't his girlfriend. Before I could react, he jumped on her and began flailing and punching her in the face. I managed to pull him off, using physical restraint only as a last resort, and he ran into the hall. That girl chased him and caught up with him in the atrium, where he threw a chair at her, knocking her down. He then kicked her in the stomach and head. Two other teachers and I ran toward them, shouting for him to stop. Eventually we got between them and he was taken to the office. He no longer attends our school. His girlfriend, I've been told they're still together, has slowly begun to return to school. The girl he attacked transferred schools because of the trauma and has since attempted to take her own life twice. This is the story of Damien. First of all, let me start by saying that you shouldn't completely blame this kid for the things I'm about to tell you. Once I give you some background, you'll understand why. Damien was an extroverted kid, polite, charismatic, and exceptionally bright. He behaved well in class, aced most of his tests with ease, and had a kind of charm that made it impossible to imagine him ever hurting anyone. But after his little sister started sharing stories about him, I began seeing him differently. I started researching everything I could about sociopaths and psychopaths online, and Damien fit far too many of those traits. He was the eldest of two children from what I can only describe as an abusive marriage. His younger sister, Chloe, was 7, a sweet, gentle little girl, only a year younger than him. She saw me as the father figure she desperately needed. Both were in my class, and Chloe would often come to me for small pieces of advice. Which dress looks better on my doll? Do these colors look good together? My best friend's birthday is next week, what should I get her? We'd chat for a few minutes before recess each day, and over time, she began to trust me completely. One Friday, a cold, gray, rain-soaked day when the students had to stay inside for recess, she approached me, clutching her old tin lunchbox against her chest, and asked shyly if she could sit beside me. Of course, I said yes. I watched her struggle to open the rusty box until she finally pried it open. Inside was a sloppy sandwich, one thin slice of ham and way too much mayonnaise. It didn't look like something a parent would prepare with care. Did you make your own lunch today? I asked. She shook her head. Mommy made it. Daddy usually does, but he's been out of the house since they fought last night. Something about that answer unsettled me. The sandwich itself seemed to radiate anger, like whoever made it wanted to send a message. I gently asked if her parents fought often. She said yes. I asked if it scared her. Again, yes. Why? I asked. She hesitated, chewing slowly, then said softly, I get scared for Damien. Mommy and Daddy always blame him for everything. They take him into their room, and I can hear him screaming and crying. I know they hit him, but I'm too scared to help. I felt a surge of anger and concern, but before I could say anything, she added something that chilled me to the bone. Sometimes we find dead animals in the backyard, and they blame him. They think he did it because he plays with them. But I know him, he's nice to me. He wouldn't do that. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was just an imaginative kid who watched too many dark TV shows. Still, part of me feared it was real. I gently asked, so you're sure Damien didn't hurt those animals? What makes you so certain? She looked conflicted but finally said, I saw him once with one of the cats. He was using her like a puppet. It was really scary, but I know he didn't kill her. I decided not to push further and changed the subject. Before she left, I told her to keep our conversation a secret. She agreed. Now, I know what you're thinking, why didn't I report this immediately? Honestly, I didn't know what to do. I needed to be sure. Maybe she was exaggerating. Maybe she was just lonely. But something inside me wouldn't let it go. Over the next week, I kept gently asking questions. Bit by bit, she opened up. She said her parents beat Damien until he bled. They didn't hit her much, only yelled or pulled her hair sometimes, but Damien got the worst of it. I began watching him closely. And sure enough, there were signs, disturbing sketches of decapitated figures in the margins of his notebooks, quick flashes of anger that vanished as fast as they appeared, and once, I saw him behind the bushes on the playground holding a dead pigeon, stretching its wings and studying it like he was fascinated. Eventually, I told another teacher, a friend of mine named Sam, and we decided we'd talk to the principal together. But before that, I wanted to be certain. That day, I asked Chloe to come to my desk under the pretext of reviewing her test. Quietly, I told her that one of her classmates said she had drawings on her arms and asked if it was true. She denied it. I pressed gently, telling her that lying wasn't good, and asked her to show me. She lifted her sleeves. Nothing. I exhaled in relief, until I saw it. On the back of her forearm was a fresh, 3-inch cut, clean and thin, like it had been made with a razor blade. My heart sank. Before I could ask anything, the bell rang. She bolted out of the room, leaving her lunchbox behind. Damien followed her. I called after him, but when he looked back, his face twisted with pure disgust, a look no 8-year-old should ever have. He knew. That realization hit me hard. I ran after them. I searched the playground, the slides, the bushes, nothing. Panic took over. Finally, I checked the bathrooms. And there they were. Chloe was curled up on the floor, silent, while Damien kicked her again and again. She wasn't even screaming, just weak, breathless whimpers. Something inside me broke. I grabbed Damien by the shoulders and slapped him, hard. It was pure instinct. I pulled Chloe into my arms and carried her straight to the nurse's office. Of course, I was fired that day. I could have been sued, but the parents never took legal action, maybe because they knew the truth, or maybe they just didn't care. A few weeks later, Sam and I met for drinks. She wasn't angry at me, in fact, she admitted she might have done the same thing. Chloe had been one of her favorite students too. 3 months later, we heard that Damien and Chloe had been transferred to another school. Child services had been contacted, and it was likely they were removed from their parents' custody. I don't know what became of Chloe. I still think about her sometimes. I'm not a religious man, but I pray she's okay, that she found happiness, that she's safe. And over the years, I've realized something: it wasn't Damien's fault. He was a product of an abusive home, a child molded by pain and violence. That doesn't excuse what he did, but I don't blame him anymore. And neither should you. I was teaching first-year primary students, grade 1, in China. One day, a little boy tried to stab a little girl in the eye with a pencil. The only reason she wasn't blinded was because he missed and hit the bridge of her nose instead, right beside her eye. They hadn't been fighting physically, just arguing, and then he suddenly tried to stab her. The girl didn't even cry, she looked more shocked than anything. When I rushed over and asked what happened, she calmly pointed to her nose, where you could clearly see the pencil mark. Thankfully, the pencil was blunt. I quickly put 2 of my best students in charge of the class and took the boy straight to the principal's office. I explained what had happened, and the principal took it very seriously. He called the boy's parents, though I'm not sure what was said, since I went back to class afterward. At the end of the month, the boy left the school. His parents said they were transferring him to a school in Australia. This happened in the early 2000s, and not in the US, so some parts might sound strange to some of you. I was in my final year of high school, and for one of our teaching practice assignments, I had to give a class to a group of 8th graders. That group had a reputation for being difficult, and everyone warned me to be cautious. Still, the supervising teacher would be in the room, so I figured I'd be fine. At first, everything was going great. I was actually impressed by how well behaved they were, especially after all the warnings I'd heard. Then I started handing out worksheets with some questions for them to answer in class. When I got to one kid, a short, skinny, almost fragile-looking 13-year-old, he suddenly reached under his desk. As I extended my arm to give him the paper, he quickly tried to slash at my hand with a box cutter he'd been hiding underneath. Back then, those were still allowed in schools for sharpening pencils. Now you see why they're banned. I was just fast enough to pull back, getting only a small scratch. But then he stood up, pressed the box cutter against my throat, and said slowly, almost calmly, "Get the fuck out." Now, I'm a big guy, about 6 feet 6 inches, and he was half my size, at best. I've also been told I have a serious case of resting bitch face that goes from intimidating when I'm neutral to terrifying when I'm angry. So, with this kid threatening me, I just glared at him with every ounce of rage I could channel and said, "Do it. Let's see what happens to you after that." We stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever, probably just a few seconds, before he pulled the cutter away, sat back down, and said with a smirk, "I like you." I was absolutely freaking out inside, but somehow managed to keep it together for the rest of the class. I finished with nothing more than a couple of shallow scratches on my hand and neck. When the bell rang, I told the supervising teacher what had happened. He hadn't noticed a thing. We went straight to the principal's office, expecting some kind of action. But no, the principal just sighed and said they already knew about the boy's behavior. The police wouldn't intervene because of his age, and the school wasn't allowed to expel students, only suspend them or notify the parents. Apparently, he was the unacknowledged son of a well-connected lawyer, which meant he basically had a free pass for anything he did. Over the years, I kept hearing stories about him. Fights. Theft. Drugs. The works. I even saw him once. He got kicked out of a party, and about 5 guys jumped him, beating him nearly to death. He just laughed maniacally the entire time, screaming that he would kill them all. Roughly 10 years after that incident, I heard his name in the news. He'd blown his hand off trying to throw a homemade explosive at a referee during a sports event, apparently because his team was losing. After being hospitalized and losing his hand, he sued the team, the police, and the paramedics, claiming they shouldn't have allowed him to bring explosives in the first place. He obviously lost the case. When I was a middle school counselor, I had a student who was a pathological liar. What really struck me wasn't just how often he lied, but that his lies had absolutely no purpose. He didn't do it to get out of trouble, to gain anything, or to manipulate anyone in particular. He just wanted attention and praise. The lies were so absurd that even the weakest bit of scrutiny would have torn them apart. A few examples. He once told me he'd played Pop Warner football the year before, but that he tackled another kid so hard the kid was hospitalized with a concussion, and later died. Because of that, he said, he was banned from all organized football for life unless he moved to Canada, where, according to him, they don't recognize American lifetime bans. After the Mandalay Bay Las Vegas shooting, he told me his uncle was one of the people who had been killed. I had just met him and believed him at first. This was in Hawaii, and it's not unusual for people there to have relatives living in or visiting Las Vegas. When I asked his uncle's name, he said, Richard something. I actually checked. It took 5 minutes to confirm that nobody by that name had been among the victims. When I confronted him, he said, nobody reports when Hawaiians die because they're racist on the mainland. He also claimed his family were mostly Bloods, but they wouldn't let him join because they were afraid he might one day want to become a Crip and give away blood secrets. Apparently, the Los Angeles gang scene was alive and thriving in Kaneohe, Hawaii, according to him. Eventually, I stopped seeing him as a client. It felt pointless. He wasn't getting anything out of counseling, he was just fabricating stories, one after another. Someone who lies that easily and compulsively, for no reason at all, isn't headed toward a bright future. I had a student who gave off a profoundly unsettling vibe. He almost never spoke, maybe one or two words now and then, and he displayed a lot of troubling behaviors. His mother was wonderful, attentive and doing everything she could to help him with school. He, however, hated her. He regularly made comments about hurting her and once even said, "Clap if you want to kill your mom," then started clapping fervently. When I tried to help him with classwork, he would stare at me with a blank expression, then pull out a sheet of paper and scribble on it angrily without breaking eye contact. He stabbed people and objects with pencils constantly. Our school is very low income, and once when I opened the back door, cockroaches poured in. Most of the students ran away, but he ran straight over, began stomping on them, and then sat down and continued crushing them after they were dead. He had a younger brother, and whenever their mother turned her back he would pinch the boy until he bled and then claim he had no idea what happened. My mom worked part-time as an aide for kids with developmental issues at my old elementary school. She loved working with children. There was one little boy she looked after for a while named Arden. He was around 6 or 7 years old, a sweet, gentle kid on the autism spectrum. He struggled with social cues and could be overly enthusiastic, which sometimes pushed other kids away. He didn't really have friends, except for one, a worn-out Beanie Baby toy pig. That little stuffed pig was his world. It was old, frayed, and patched from years of love, but he treated it like it was alive. On the playground, he would put it on the swings, slide it down the slide, and talk to it because no one else would. The toy was his only friend, the only one who didn't tease him or walk away. Then there was another boy, Barry. He was the complete opposite. He had severe behavioral problems, violent, manipulative, completely lacking empathy. He lied constantly and loved to steal. He also had an obsession with scissors. The teachers once found a whole stash of them in his desk, the sharp art room kind. He liked dragging them across his skin to make red lines and told other kids he could write the alphabet on their arms with them. His parents didn't want to acknowledge any of it. One day in the resource room, where the special needs kids went for extra help, Barry saw Arden playing with his pig and decided he wanted it. Arden, trying to be friendly, said, "Why don't we all play together at recess?" Barry agreed. At lunch, my mom was on duty watching the playground when Arden came running up to her, sobbing hysterically. He had 2 deep, bleeding cuts across his cheek and a chunk of his hair hacked off. Between choked sobs, all he could say was, "He killed him. He killed him." Another teacher rushed him to the nurse while my mom went to find out what happened. In the far corner of the playground, near the fence, she found Barry trying to hide what he'd done. The toy pig was ripped apart, stuffing and fabric scattered everywhere. Barry had cut a hole where the pig's private parts would be and jammed a stick straight through its body, out where the head used to be. He was in the middle of burying a bloody pair of scissors in the dirt when my mom found him. She had to physically restrain him, thank God he wasn't still holding the scissors, as he kicked, screamed, and fought back. Later, she learned what had happened from other kids. Arden had let Barry play with his toy. Everything was fine until Barry suddenly pulled out the scissors and began mutilating the pig. Arden begged him to stop and tried to grab it, but Barry attacked him instead, cutting his hair, dragging the open scissors across his cheeks, and saying, "I just killed your friend. Now I'm gonna kill you too." Barry never came back to school after that. From what my mom heard, he was sent to a children's psychiatric ward. Arden stayed home for a few weeks. When he finally returned, he was quieter, more withdrawn, and afraid to talk to anyone. My mom and the other special ed teachers pooled their money together, found the same type of Beanie Baby online, and gave it to him. They told him his friend had been in the hospital for a few weeks, but now he's all better and ready to play again. It helped. Arden slowly began to open up again and even started spending time with some of the girls who also brought their stuffed animals to school. That was about 6 or 7 years ago. Barry would be in his early teens now. I really hope he got the help he needed. My mom was a preschool teacher, and I used to help her out as an assistant in her classroom. There was one 4-year-old boy she struggled with, a child who genuinely seemed to enjoy hurting others. Everyone, teachers and students alike, was scared of him and what might set him off. My mom tried to get him professional help, but his family refused, insisting that nothing was wrong with their precious angel. One day, my mom got a phone call from the boy's grandmother. She was sobbing so hard she could barely speak. When she finally managed to explain, what she said was horrifying. The boy had put her poodle in the microwave and turned it on, cooking it until the poor dog died. According to the grandmother, he said he wanted to reheat lunch for himself. She had stepped outside to get the mail, and when she came back in, she heard the most awful noises coming from the kitchen. By the time she reached the microwave, it was too late. The dog was gone. The worst part was that she found him standing in front of the microwave, laughing as it happened. She told my mom she had contacted Child Protective Services immediately, and that the boy had been taken into their custody. He would not be returning to preschool. Years later, I saw his name in the newspaper. He'd been arrested for attempted murder and was facing a long prison sentence. I have a student who is most likely affected by fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS. It's sadly common in our community. He doesn't seem capable of feeling empathy, at all. He knows he's not supposed to laugh when people get hurt, but he just can't help it. To him, it's the funniest thing in the world. Every time someone gets injured, he bursts out laughing. Once, a student slipped on some ice and got knocked out on the playground, and he was sitting there on the ground, laughing hysterically. He also has zero sense of accountability for his actions. He's always accidentally hurting other kids, and yes, I watch closely, so I know they're usually genuine accidents, but he never reacts the way a typical child would. He once hit a girl's finger with a racket during gym and didn't even think to apologize. The worst incident was when he opened a door right onto another student's foot, ripping the kid's toenail completely off. He just stood there, saw that the student was hurt, and walked straight to class like nothing had happened. When we pulled him out to apologize while the other student was being bandaged up, he simply said, "Sorry," then went back to class shouting, "Did you see all that blood?" At first, I thought he was just mean, that he enjoyed causing pain. But I've come to realize it's not malice. He simply doesn't feel what others feel. It's actually written into his education plan that he has to practice recognizing and responding to other people's emotions. And then, in the same class, I have a girl who's the exact opposite in all the worst ways. She lies, manipulates, and physically hurts others, but she does it all with full awareness. She understands exactly what she's doing. Before she arrived, my class was harmonious. The kids got along well, worked together, supported one another. Now, it's fractured, little factions, cliques, and kids isolating each other. Honestly, if these two ever teamed up when they're older, the one who can't feel empathy and the one who can but chooses to ignore it, they'd make an unstoppable pair of villains.